There are mountains on this planet that human beings have climbed because human beings climb mountains. And there is one mountain on this planet that human beings have never climbed. And the reason they have never climbed it is not that it is too high, and not that it is too technically difficult, and not that the weather makes it impossible, although the weather on its slopes is extreme and its routes present serious mountaineering challenges. The reason Mount Kailash has never been climbed is something else entirely, and the Chinese monks who have lived in its proximity for centuries, who have circumambulated its base in ritual pilgrimage for generations, who have maintained monasteries in its shadow and studied its effects on the human beings who approach it, and who have passed down oral traditions about its nature from teacher to student across hundreds of years, are now saying things about this mountain that they have not said publicly before. They are saying why it was never meant to be climbed. They are saying what happens to people who attempt it or who approach it with the intention of reaching its summit. They are saying what the mountain is, not in the metaphorical or poetic sense that Westerners tend to apply to sacred geography, but in a specific and literal sense that the traditions they carry have always maintained, and that the experiences of people in proximity to the mountain continue to confirm. And what they are saying is terrifying, not because it invokes supernatural horror in the conventional sense, but because it describes something about the nature of physical reality at this specific location on the Earth's surface that does not fit inside the frameworks that modern secular rationalism uses to understand the world, and that the people who have been closest to this mountain for the longest time have known about and have been trying to communicate across a barrier of cultural and epistemological translation for as long as contact between their tradition and the outside world has existed. Mount Kailash rises to 6,638 meters above sea level in the western Tibetan Plateau, in what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region of China. It is not the highest mountain in the Himalayas. It is not even among the 100 highest peaks in the range. By the purely technical metrics of altitude and mountaineering difficulty, it should not be the most significant mountain on Earth. And yet, it is the only major peak in the Himalayan system that no human being has ever reached the summit of, and the only major peak that is protected by a prohibition on climbing. Attempts that is enforced not primarily by governmental regulation, though the Chinese and Indian authorities have both at various points restricted climbing access, but by something that functions more like a collective human understanding, that reaching the summit of this mountain is not something that should be done. That understanding is shared across 4 of the world's major religious traditions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the ancient Tibetan Bon religion that predates Buddhism's arrival in Tibet. And it is one of the most remarkable points of convergence in the history of comparative religion that traditions as different as these 4, with their vastly different theologies and cosmologies and ritual systems, agree with complete unanimity that Mount Kailash is the center of the world, the axis around which the cosmos rotates, the place where the human and the divine are in closest proximity, and the place that must not be desecrated by human ambition to stand at its highest point. The monks are now saying why. And the why has several dimensions that operate simultaneously, and that the monks who are speaking are careful to present not as separate explanations, but as facets of a single reality that their tradition has understood as a unity, even when individual facets of that understanding seem to come from completely different domains of knowledge. The first dimension is the one that is most accessible to people coming from outside the Tibetan and Himalayan religious traditions, because it maps most directly onto categories that modern people can engage with, without accepting any specific theological framework. It is the dimension of observable physical effects. The monks describe, and people who have undertaken the Kora, the ritual circumambulation of the mountain that pilgrims complete at the mountain's base, confirm that the passage of time in proximity to Mount Kailash does not behave normally. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a poetic description of how time seems to pass differently when one is engaged in deep spiritual practice. The monks are describing something that has been reported with sufficient consistency by sufficient numbers of people from sufficiently diverse backgrounds that it constitutes a pattern of testimony that demands attention rather than dismissal. People who spend extended periods near the mountain report that their fingernails and hair grow at rates dramatically accelerated beyond their normal rate of growth. The acceleration is not subtle. As in stilled. People who undertake the 3-day Kora and who monitor their own hair and nail growth during that period describe growth that they characterize as equivalent to 2 to 3 weeks of normal growth compressed into 72 hours. Climbers and trekkers who have approached the mountain's flanks without attempting the summit report. Disorientation, confusion about elapsed time, and a sense that the relationship between their subjective experience of time's passage and the actual passage of time as measured by clocks and the movement of the sun is unreliable in ways it is not reliable anywhere else. They have been. The monks' explanation for this effect is specific. and it draws on a framework for understanding the nature of reality that the Tibetan Buddhist and Bon traditions have developed over centuries of observation and contemplative investigation. They describe Mount Kailash as a location where what they call the fabric of ordinary reality is thinner than it is elsewhere, where the boundary between the dimension of physical manifestation that human beings normally inhabit and the deeper dimensions of reality that underlie and generate the physical dimension is permeable in ways it is not permeable at ordinary locations. This permeability, they say, affects the physical processes that are normally regulated by the ordinary conditions of physical reality, including the biological processes of growth and the psychological experience of time's passage. The mountain is not doing something to time. It is located at a point where the ordinary conditions that make time behave consistently are themselves different, and the biological and psychological effects that people report are the natural consequence of biological organisms operating in conditions that differ from the conditions those organisms were designed by evolution to function within. The second dimension of the monk's explanation concerns the specific spiritual geography of the mountain and why that geography makes the summit specific low, high off limits in a way that the mountain's base and immediate surroundings are not. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Mount Kailash is identified as the physical manifestation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain that in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology stands at the center of the universe with its roots in the underworld and its peak in the heavens, around which the celestial bodies rotate, and from which the four great rivers of the WWW world flow outward to the four cardinal directions. This identification is taken literally, not allegorically, by the traditions that hold it. The mountain is not a symbol of the cosmic axis, it is the cosmic axis. Its physical form in the material world is the point where the vertical dimension of reality, the dimension that connects the lower realms through the human realm to the higher realms, intersects with the horizontal dimension of the physical world. And the summit of the mountain in this framework is not simply the highest physical point of a geological feature. It is the point of intersection between the physical dimension and the dimension immediately above it, the point where, in the traditional understanding, the human realm gives way to the realm of the divine. The monks say that attempting to climb to the summit of Mount Kailash is therefore not simply an act of mountaineering hubris. It is an attempt to enter a domain that the structure of reality itself places outside the proper territory of human beings in their ordinary physical form. Not because the divine realm is hostile to human beings or wishes to harm those who approach it, but because the conditions that obtain at the boundary between dimensions are not conditions that a human physical organism can survive, and because the nature of a person would encounter at that boundary is not something that a human mind structured by ordinary physical existence is equipped to process without dissolution. The mountain does not punish those who attempt to climb it. It simply is what it is, and what it is at its summit is something that the human organism as currently constituted cannot enter and remain intact. The third dimension is the one the monks are most reluctant to speak about directly, and the one whose communication across cultural and linguistic barriers is most prone to distortion. But it is the dimension that the oldest layers of the Bon tradition, which predates Buddhism in Tibet and which the monks describe as preserving knowledge about the mountain from a period of human history, so remote that its origins are not precisely datable, addresses most specifically. It concerns what the mountain is in a sense that goes beyond its role as cosmic axis or sacred peak within any of the religious traditions that have formed around it. The Bon tradition describes Mount Kailash as a structure, not a naturally formed geological feature that has been given sacred significance by human religious imagination, but an intentionally constructed or intentionally modified feature whose physical form was shaped by intelligence and intention rather than by the geological processes that formed the surrounding landscape. The four nearly perfectly planar faces of the mountain, each oriented precisely toward one of the four cardinal directions, each presenting a surface that departs dramatically from the kind of irregular, erosion-sculpted form that characterizes naturally formed peaks, are cited by the Bon tradition as evidence of Ti, his intentional formation. The near-perfect symmetry of the mountain's form, which has struck every observer from every tradition who has approached it with enough geometrical awareness to notice, is not, in the Bon understanding, a coincidence of geological processes. It is the visible signature of intelligence operating at a scale and with a precision that places it outside the category of human construction. The monks are careful at this point to say that they are not claiming to know who or what shaped the mountain or when that shaping occurred. The Bon tradition preserves the fact of the mountain's intentional formation and the purpose of that formation to mark and to maintain the point of intersection between and dimensions, to function as a kind of anchor or stabilizer for the structure of the cosmos at its central axis, but it does not preserve a detailed account of the agents of that formation. What it does preserve is a set of observations about the effects of the mountain that have been documented across the centuries of human proximity to it. And these observations are what give the traditions warnings about climbing most of their specific content. The effects that the monks describe are not limited to the acceleration of biological processes and the distortion of the time sense that pilgrims report. They describe a range of effects on human consciousness and human psychology that cluster into patterns that are consistent enough across different individuals and different time periods to suggest that they are properties of the location rather than individual psychological responses. People who spend time near the mountain report an intensification of their mental and emotional state that functions like amplification rather than alteration. Existing fears become more intense, existing desires become more compelling, existing confusions become more disorienting, existing clarity becomes more lucid. The monks describe the mountain as an environment in which the filtering and dampening functions that ordinary consciousness performs on the raw intensity of experience are reduced or suspended, such that whatever is present in a person's mind is experienced with a directness and an intensity that ordinary daily consciousness buffers against. For a person whose mind is well ordered, whose fears are manageable, whose relationship with their own psychological contents is stable, this intensification produces experiences that those who report them describe as among the most profound and meaningful of their lives. For a person whose psychological contents include unresolved fears, unprocessed grief, unexamined drives, or deep confusion, the intensification produces experiences that can be genuinely destabilizing. The monks describe this effect as the primary reason that the tradition of the Kora, walking around the mountain rather than attempting to ascend it, developed and persisted. The circumambulation keeps the pilgrim in proximity to the mountain's field of effects while maintaining the human being's relationship to the ordinary physical landscape, moving through it, walking on it, remaining oriented within horizontal space. Ascending the mountain takes the human being out of the horizontal space of ordinary physical existence and moves them into a vertical relationship with the mountain's central axis, in which the effects that are manageable at the mountain's base become progressively more intense with each increase in altitude. The accounts of people who have approached the mountain's flanks with serious climbing intent, and there have been several such attempts across the 20th century, including a controversial permit granted to Spanish climber Jesus Martinez Novas in 2001 that was ultimately withdrawn following protests from Hindu and Buddhist communities, describe experiences during those approaches that are consistent with the monks' description of the intensification effect becoming more pronounced with altitude. Disorientation, psychological disturbance, a sense of being watched or assessed, physical symptoms without clear medical explanation, and in some accounts, a direct experiential communication that the attempt should not continue. The withdrawal of the 2001 climbing permit after worldwide protest from the Hindu and Buddhist communities that consider the mountain sacred was the most recent major confrontation between the mountaineering world's claim that any peak that can technically be climbed should be climbed and the traditions that have maintained the prohibition on Kailash's summit for millennia. The mountaineering community's response to the prohibition has generally been respectful in practice, if not always in philosophical agreement, and no climbing attempt has been made on Mount Kailash since the permit controversy. But the monks who are now speaking publicly about the reasons for the prohibition are doing so in part because they believe that the respectful restraint that has characterized the mountaineering community's response to the mountain is based on a cultural sensitivity that, while valuable, is not the same as an understanding of why the prohibition exists. They want the world to understand not just that the traditions say the mountain should not be climbed, but what those traditions know about what the mountain is and what the consequences of a summit attempt would be for the individuals involved. Those consequences, in the monk's account, are not supernatural punishment in the conventional religious sense of divine retribution falling on the impious. They are more specific and more physical than that, framing suggests. The monks describe what would happen to a human being who reached the summit of Mount Kailash as a function of what the summit is, rather than as a response from any external agency to the act of reaching it. At the summit, where the intersection between the physical dimension and the dimension above it is at its most immediate. The conditions that constitute ordinary physical reality are at their most attenuated. The physical organism of the human body, which evolved to function wise within a specific range of physical conditions, and which depends on the stability and consistency of those conditions for its continued integrity, encounters at that point conditions that are sufficiently different from the ordinary conditions of physical existence that the organism's ability to maintain its integrity is compromised. Not by cold or altitude or weather, though all of these are severe, but by something more fundamental. By the direct encounter with conditions of existence for which the human physical organism was not designed and to which it has no adaptive response. The monks use language that translates as dissolution or reabsorption to describe what would happen, and they are careful to distinguish this from death in the ordinary sense, though they acknowledge that from the outside, the distinction might not be apparent. The rivers that flow from the base of Mount Kailash are cited by the monks as the most tangible and most universally acknowledged evidence of the mountain's extraordinary nature. From the flanks of a single peak flow four of Asia's great rivers, the Indus flowing northwest into Pakistan, the Brahmaputra flowing east and then south into the Indian subcontinent, the Karnali flowing south into the Ganges system, and the Sutlej flowing west and then south. The probability of four major river systems originating from the slopes of a single mountain and flowing in four cardinal directions is a geographical coincidence so extreme that the monks declined to call it a coincidence at all. The Bon tradition and the Hindu tradition both describe the four rivers as flowing from the Mahespasamwat, a mountain, because the mountain is the center from which the waters of the world proceed outward to the four quarters of the earth, which is to say that the geographic reality of the rivers confirms the cosmological claim about the mountain's central position in the structure of the world, rather than the cosmological claim being a mythological interpretation imposed on a geographical coincidence. And what the monks are saying, taken in its entirety, is that Mount Kailash is not a mountain in the sense that every other mountain on earth is a mountain. It is a feature of the landscape that marks and maintains a structural property of reality itself that was either formed or selected for this purpose by intelligence operating at a scale that human civilization has not yet achieved and may never achieve, and that interacts with human beings, who approach it in ways that reflect its fundamental nature as a point of intersection between dimensions of realize. Tie that human existence normally keeps separate. They are saying that the prohibition on climbing it is not a religious convention or a cultural tradition or a political decision. It is a recognition, encoded in the traditions of four separate religious lineages across thousands of years of accumulated observation, of what the mountain actually is and what actually happens when human beings attempt to violate the boundary it represents. They are, saying this now, publicly, with a directness that is unusual for traditions that have generally preferred to communicate this kind of knowledge through initiation and direct transmission rather than through public statement, because they believe the world has reached a point where the knowledge needs to be stated plainly rather than preserved esoterically. Mount Kailash was never meant to be climbed. Now you know why.